Okay, this is number 12 of 12 for Oakwood University's Black Psychological Perspectives. As per usual, we'll pray, then we'll get into some of the topics here. Um, Thank you, Lord, for this opportunity to discuss health and wellness and moving forward as you would have us to do. Please be with us as we discuss possibilities for reducing stigma and helping others. In your son's precious name, amen. All right, so this chapter and these two chapters, which I've kind of combined into one due to time and, within the semester, drug use and abuse is chapter 14. Chapter 15 goes over pro-social and antisocial behavior. And again, this is coming from Allison and Belgrave's book, African American Psychology. Here's the book. I always got it close by. All right. Excellent reference source. All right. So some vocabulary. I've been going over SAMHSA and Substance Abuse and Mental Health Agency. E-cigarettes or electronic cigarettes are good to know about. Legalization, specifically as it relates to marijuana, but also as it relates to many other drugs, but it's definitely happened within some states related to marijuana. Advertising and marketing, there's been specific campaigns in relation to drugs and alcohol that have particularly impacted Black people, and we'll talk about that a bit more. Co-occurring, such as co-occurring issues, illnesses, diseases. Right? We've also had risk and protective factors that we've looked at before, but I just want to have folks considering those things that put people at risk, but things that may also protect them from things getting worse. Crack versus powdered cocaine is one issue to consider, and fewer people are using crack or even powdered cocaine, but the sentencing disparities is worth discussing. Cultural racism is a term that was used in this chapter. Another one that I thought was really interesting is marijuana disorder. Right? Marijuana disorder. There's actually a term. Bullying and victimization, as has happened all too often, especially within the last few months. We've seen young people succumbing to suicide related to bullying and victimization, particularly Black youth. All right, confounding variables, right? Or confounding, at least that's the term. Altruism, right? Philanthropy. Pro-social and antisocial. Civic engagement, social activism, social justice versus justice. And that's one last piece I put in there. I have my critiques of the term itself, social justice, but also some of the folk who enact certain postures and stances based upon their belief of what social justice may or may not be. That said, that's the vocabulary. Let's look into chapter 14, drug use and abuse. And we already know right off the bat that there's overwhelming racial bias in marijuana arrests. Black people are 3.7 times more likely to be arrested for marijuana possession than white people, despite reporting virtually the same usage rate of marijuana. So that gets right into the sentencing disparities that I was discussing earlier, right? So here's some interesting pieces here, and follow me here, that youth ages 12 to 17 who are white have the highest prevalence of drug use. Next is African American, then Hispanic and Asians. But Black youth, 12 to 17-year-olds, aren't readily using drugs. Okay? This may be a common misconception or whatever it is, but it's worth it to note that these studies are out here. However, as youth get older, between the ages of 18 to 25, Asian students still have the lowest consumption overall, but usage varies by type of drug. So as we're talking about drug usage, it gets complicated. Whites and African Americans has the highest usage of marijuana and other illicit drugs. Overall, Drug use among African Americans is less common than it is among whites and other ethnic groups. However, African Americans and Latinos show higher levels of social problems related to drug uses. I mentioned before, incarceration is one of those, but also HIV as well as violence, often due either to a lack of resources and violence, as Dr. Amos Wilson, the late Dr. Amos Wilson would say, violence is an expression of impotence. When you lack resource and options, you express your limited options to engage. So another thing that the book brought out is African Americans have difficulty quitting smoking due to ongoing marketing and flavor campaigns like menthol or some other snappy flavor that the cigarettes makers or even the marijuana cigarette makers may put out. There used to be a song out by Public Enemy called 1 Million Bottle Bags that exposed me to the interesting nature of 40-ounce drinks in paper bags, right? That's a whole piece in and of itself, right? The 40 ounce is the leftover liquor, and it's sold, and back in my day as a young person, it was sold for $1, maybe $1.50, and if it was halfway decent, it might be sold for $2. Then you'd get a brown paper bag, because as you walked outside, if you had an open container and an open bag, you could be charged for a crime. Again, this goes to kind of criminalization of being a person in America, but you can be charged for a crime for drinking this ill-fated liquor that's been targeted and marketed to your community. 1 million bottle bags. Look up the song, look up that time. It's very, very interesting. Again, usage for African American youth is different than white youth. Expectations of a positive experience during drinking did not predict alcohol consumption among African American youth as it did for white youth. For all youth, a major cause of morbidity, mortality, and disability and property destruction was related to alcohol consumption. African American ages 12 to 17 were 8.6% of those who consumed, but less than 1% reported binge drinking. Less than 1% of African Americans 12 to 17 years old. So, do we know the difference, right? And I hope you do know the difference between social drinking, problem drinking, binge drinking, and just drinking to get drunk. But these all have different impacts on people's lives. If you're drinking occasionally at a social function, walking away, still able to live your life without throwing up like a binge drinker might, or getting blackout drunk once a week like a problem drinker might, or being consistently drunk and having to drink in the morning in order to medicate yourself and get yourself right, as it were. But these are a range of things, but some people don't think about that until they get into college and have a conversation about what it means to consume alcohol to the excesses or to a balanced manner. Right, smoking. Menthols are more carcinogenic and harder to get off of if you are addicted to menthols. I remember watching many relatives smoking these long black cigarettes that I did not see anywhere in the neighborhood where I grew up, and I grew up in a mostly white suburban area. But I went to go visit my relatives who lived closer to the city. Menthols were everywhere. Everybody had a pack, teenagers to adults. Right. Marketing the black communities for years in magazines and on billboards, right? Eventually, the U.S. FDA, the Food and Drug Administration in the United States, banned menthols because they were directly carcinogenic and targeting black people. So in 2007, after this great ban goes down, e-cigarettes come about, again with the flavors, right? And white people usage is most likely, right? But African American youth are least knowledgeable and least likely to see the greater health risks when it comes to e-cigarettes, right? And it's a gateway to paper cigarettes. Another concern and another marketing type campaign has been with Black and mild cigars and cigarillos. And the marketing never seems to stop, right? So marijuana usage among young people ages 18 to 25, it's about 23% reported usage within the last 30 days. Youth ages 12 to 17, 54% report that it's easy to obtain. And African American youth, again, are less likely to see the health consequences of marijuana. Here's that term, marijuana disorder, was greater among African Americans than other groups. Marijuana appears to be a gateway drug for cigarette uses for African Americans, even though marijuana usage drops off at 26 years old for most African Americans. Right, this marijuana disorder, right, kind of being almost constantly high or having the effects, right, of that moment, bro. All right, let me not get too far in it because I know too many people who suffer from it. All right, cocaine. Right, in the 1970s and 1980s, crack is developed and distributed, and crack using baking soda or other methods to cook it up and distribute it. Right, in the 1990s and the 2000s, there was disproportionate sentencing between crack was getting longer sentences, powder was getting less time, and crack was usually more associated with black defendants versus white defendants who were more often using powdered cocaine. Same stuff, just racism. It's plain and simple. And that's what the Attorney General Eric Holder found and was trying to look into, and many other attorneys and other legal scholars found that there were disproportionate sentencings happening to African Americans. The war on drugs happened, starts in the 70s under the Nixon administration, but drugs seem to expand into the United States nonetheless. African Americans are more likely to use more addictive and a potent form if they do use, and crack is more addictive and potent. Right? Emergency room episodes are higher for African Americans than for whites. And African Americans are more likely to report needing substance abuse treatment than whites, but yet sometimes they may lack the connection to actually be able to do that. So some of the risk and protective factors, right? African Americans have lower usage in child and adolescence, but when it comes to drug use, they catch up in adulthood. Black smokers fare worse on nicotine than other ethnic groups in their lungs as well as an addictive property. African American parent knowledge by middle school helped protect African American youth from later drug use, but strong relationships help to stop drug use as well, such as mentoring or a strong peer group that meets at church regularly or engages in community service regularly. Sadly, older sibling usage and hiding usage by that older sibling encourage later use by the younger sibling. African American youth who hang with risky peers had less drug refusal efficacy. So what that means is that peers who may be engaging in risky behavior in general, and specifically drug-related behavior, it was harder for them to say no to whatever drug that they did not even want to use when they thought about it, but now that they're in the moment, the peer pressure gets to them. African American youth is less in high school, even if their academics are poor. So it's in the book even said this is hard to predict what the drug usage is going to be like for African American youth. And if you're working individually, it's safe to not make assumptions about African American youth drug usage, but it is good to ask and have a sense of where they're at. Some other protective factors and programs, right? Spirituality was an important protective factor for many African Americans. Understanding who they are, where they come from, and answering broader questions about life in general was important. Ethnic knowledge, pride, and practices seem to go hand in hand, particularly if you're talking about African people and spirituality, right? And I'm looking for one other piece here, but African identity and values are important as well. And there are several different types of programs that have been developed that can help address and increase pro-social behavior. The Abin Aya Youth Project is a culturally specific social development curriculum targeted at increasing protective factors and decreasing risk factors for violence, early and risky sexual behavior, drug use, and school delinquency. The program uses an African-centered framework and is implemented with African American youth ages 10 to 14. Your book is just full of great programs that are available for review and consideration if you're looking to address some of these issues. Man, just so many challenges that people have faced from, exposure to violence and other issues. All right, chapter 15, pro-social and antisocial behavior, I think is important to address. Black people have given so much to each other, right? And I'll talk about that in just a moment here, but this idea that's linked to communalism, the generosity, the cooperation, the honesty, as we were talking about in the last piece, engaged in seeking justice, right? Black people have done that for a long time. Social, economic, political, ancestral, right? The Black Church, the NAACP, the National Association or Council of Negro Women, the SCLC, the Urban League, fraternities and sororities, and civic-minded groups like Delta Sigma Theta and their voting drives, or Martin Luther King and Coretta Scott King working together to address injustice. Despite the limited studies in the literature, African Americans are pro-social in history and in their ongoing deeds. So never think that Black people aren't pro-social or that they're antisocial exclusive. There's a small group, and they get way too much press. So when it comes to civics and activism, civic engagement is doing something that makes a positive difference within the community. African American women have been involved with civic engagement, and those who are more likely to be involved with politics than white women who are more into developing community projects. For example, and that's one study that was brought out. African American youth are more likely to be involved with civics related to social justice and community system change, right? And high racial identity contributes to civic engagement, according to a study with 303 African American youth. Right. Some of the challenges in the context of antisocial behavior, right? The typical Black household now has just 6% of the wealth as the typical white household, according to Demos and the Institute on Assets and Social Policy. I mentioned Antonio Moore, Yvette Carnell, Sandy Darity. They've all talked about this wealth disparity. And I think it's important for us to be aware of this growing wealth disparity. Social programs through philanthropy of Black people for Black people often lack the capital, but nonetheless, Black people give 25% of their income more than other ethnic groups, right, per capita. So we're not giving as much, but we're giving nearly all that we have towards helping other people because we know how important it is, right? Issues like incarceration and the police presence and higher in low-income neighborhoods is a huge concern, right? And it doesn't help the overall ecology and environment for Black life when you're constantly stressed and worried, and that your child may or may not come home after an altercation with someone who should be there to protect them, but may not allow them to make it home. Trayvon, Tamir, Eric, Sandra. So many names that we know of people who have not made it home after an interaction with the police, or those who wish they were police. Don't get me started on that. All right, violence, right? everything from war to the Middle Passage to slavery to the violence of Jim Crow and the current practices towards men and women, right? And we really didn't resolve that. As Dick Gregory used to say, America's problem, everybody talks about they don't have a father, but America's problem is that it doesn't have a mother. And we just sat up here stinking, didn't take a shower, didn't clean off after years and years of racialized segregation and discrimination and killing and thievery and blood and guts and death. We're just sitting up here stinking. We haven't really addressed that. And we've continued on with some of these same practices. Right? We can look into theories of social learning and social organization for ways to address and resolve violence. As special shout out to my mentor and Association of Black Psychologists, longtime participant, board member, president, photographer, historian, Halford Fairchild, also editor as well. But he has several books and things that he's written with his students over the years on resolving the issue of violence within America, because it's huge. It pervades so much of what we do. It's a part of our culture, right? Poverty is violence, and by design, as Martin Luther King and Mandela have talked about, right? These limited resources, the lack of protection, can lead to gangs. And poverty is a major contributor towards gangs developing, because you need people who band together to help others survive, right? And in this environment where people enact power over one another, rape and intimate partner violence becomes all the more frequent and violent. So as I check in and then I pose a few questions, first check in, how do you feel after thinking about Black people in this clinical, psychological, and factual way? We've gone through, this is the 12th of our series of videos where we're discussing Black psychological perspectives, and a lot of which we're discussing psychological theories, right? And studies. And we're looking at it from a clinical approach, but it isn't always resonating with our heart and who we are. I don't want to dismiss facts because I believe we run into huge problems when we dismiss science. But I also want to acknowledge facts as well as how we feel about those facts, because that leads us to action, to actually do something about things. And sometimes I wonder, after people hear these kinds of things, or when they think of themselves and they're tired of being let down, they're tired of being put down, and they want to be up, can Black people be happy and successful? Can they even accept success? I was going to start a whole research agenda around Black success and Black excellence, but there were people who knocked that down. They did not believe in such things. And they didn't want to believe in such things. And that would have been a whole other study in and of itself, and I may get to that one day. But right now, I'm just stuck on Black people who are actually at least achieving in some measure in society as it relates to college going. I'm interested in that conversation, but in my research and when I talk to people about my research, they really have a hard time with ideas and notions of happiness and success. All right, how do you feel since you've been informed by these facts, right? Now that you know it, you can't go back, right? You know too much now to just accept basic facts, and your way of thinking has been changed. And I always wonder, and as I walk around this beautiful campus, this historically Black college, and now university, as I interact with people here in the South as well, right? Place where the pain but also the joy is real, right? And people are very real here in the South. I ask, who are these resilient Black people who defy odds and stereotypes? We can learn so much more from them. So this is just me checking in generally, but I have some broader questions. What role does a Black church play in addressing drug use and antisocial behavior? How can educated church-going Black people promote pro-social behavior? Is that enough to fight against the challenges Black people face psychologically and with sociology? What have we've seen when it comes to Black life and drug culture, and how does that connect with what we need to grow? And along with that question, I'm specifically thinking about legalization. Right? What can Black people in general do to address the challenges of violence? Right? We talked about poverty, but we also talked about more intimate violence. How do we address those challenges? Because we definitely cannot let fear cripple us, and we haven't done that. Again, we're resilient people. All right, that's it. I'm kind of sad, but if you've watched this far, I'm letting you know we have a bonus video which will be on our trip to Montgomery, Alabama, and the Peace and Justice Memorial and Museum. So I'll be sharing that next time. Thank you for watching thus far. If you have, or if you've only watched one, I hope these videos have been informative for you. Let us know. I left my email there if you're looking to contact us, if you want notes, or just wanted to make a comment. Hope all is well with you, and have a blessed day.